Alright, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome back. It's me, Addy, again, and I hope you guys are doing amazing as always. Hot on the heels of playing Final Fantasy II in our Final Fantasy Marathon over on Twitch, where I'm playing all the single-player mainline titles in Square's beloved series that I've yet to experience, we jumped straight in to Final Fantasy III, specifically the Pixel Remastered Edition. And the other night, I purged the world of darkness and rolled the credits in the game. So I'm here as usual with my mini review of the experience. I want to start by saying that Final Fantasy III was a very quirky game. It's the kind of game that makes you intentionally cast mini on all of your party members to have them traverse ant-sized dungeons. It's the kind of game that doesn't allow your airship to fly over mountains, even though you're clearly much higher than their peaks. And it's a game that doesn't have any ethers to restore your MP, thereby raising your cortisol levels as you go through extremely long and arduous dungeons while worrying about mana conservation. What's strange is that I'm not sure whether I liked or disliked these outlandish elements of the game. While it should seem obvious that I wouldn't be the biggest fan of them, and to be fair, a part of me wasn't, there were times where, admittedly, I did appreciate them. It is cool that for once a Final Fantasy game makes you want to intentionally turn your party members into ants, and having to find creative ways to fight foes in this form was honestly quite fun at times. Not being able to fly over mountains with my airship all changed once I unlocked the final ship, which allows you to cross smaller mountain ranges. That's right, as you progress, you gain access to increasingly improved modes of overworld travel, and this evolving approach to airships really made me appreciate the game's take on them more than any other in the franchise, really. And even though it was stressful and taxing having to go through long dungeons in the game while having to worry about running out of MP, I nevertheless did like the risk-reward aspect of it that made me ask myself, well, how far should I push this dungeon before I teleport back to my airship to rest up? But yeah, once again, just like with the previous scenarios, a part of me didn't love this element of the game. And ultimately I needed to ask, why were there no ethers in Final Fantasy III? This love-hate relationship pretty much sums up my entire experience with the game. Not only did it have elements like the aforementioned ones that I had mixed attitudes towards, but it also possessed qualities that I either liked or disliked with no middle ground. Since I like to think that I'm a pretty positive guy, I'll start with the aspects that I did like, the biggest one being the class or job system. Now this is one of the most defining features for most games in the franchise, so it was really cool getting to witness its inception here with Final Fantasy III. I was a big fan of the way that the job system was implemented in Tactics, which remains my third favorite Final Fantasy game to this day, so I was really excited to see what Square's first crack at the system would look like here in Final Fantasy III. And I'm happy to say that it did not disappoint. I loved it. Not only did I get to see most, if not all, the jobs from Tactics, which I already felt boasted a great plethora, but I even saw ones that I'd never even heard of before, such as Vikings, Evokers, Scholars, and more, all of whom looked amazing with the lovely sprite work of the Pixel Remaster. The breadth here was insane, and while I didn't get to try out each and every job in the game, I still did get to experience some of the essential ones like White Mage and Black Mage, as well as my personal favorite jobs in the franchise, those being the Monk, Dragoon, and Dark Knight, and they were more than satisfactory to play. It was great seeing each of them having their unique and iconic strengths, abilities, and equipment, and I could really appreciate how the game itself would encourage experimentation with different jobs via the NPCs, giving you hints about which job would give you the best chances of defeating the upcoming enemies and bosses. My favorite example of this was a dungeon that was rife with enemies that could clone themselves if attacked by a non-Dark Knight. When I realized that, I was elated, since at that point in my playthrough, I'd really wanted to work towards the fearsome late-game Dark Knight class since the very beginning. And then, I turned not one but two of my characters into Dark Knights, and it was a hell of a good time. Most jobs in this game also serve as upgrades to previous ones. For example, the Devout and Mages class, who I'd never heard of prior to this game, behave as extensions to the White Mage and Black Mage. That was something else that I liked, as it bolstered the number of my spell uses. That's right, this game's mana system, unlike its predecessor, mirrors the approach from the very first Final Fantasy. Instead of having MP as a character stat that depletes in varying amounts based on the spell cast, it tracks the number of uses for a group of spells, with a number of uses depending on the spell's level. With that said, I think this is a good spot to segue into Final Fantasy III's most apparent characteristic, which is the fact that it feels a lot like Final Fantasy I and doesn't exactly present itself as a follow-up to Final Fantasy II. While it does evolve the series in a few ways, it often takes a step or two back. But let's begin by exploring the ways that it does feel like a successor to 2. For starters, it introduced the job system, as we spoke about. It also fixed a lot of Final Fantasy II's issues such as the obnoxiously high enemy encounter rate and poor dungeon configurations with a myriad of useless rooms. And the level design in general is the best out of all 3 games I've played so far, with dungeons having secret tunnels that lead you to app rewards, and the overworld having an awesome layout. Seriously, it's easy to navigate, prompting you to look up things much less than in the first 2 games. It packs a lot of optional areas with secret, recognizable bosses, and the concept of allowing the player to travel between a giant sky island and the greater half of the world that rests atop the ocean below really emphasizes the enormity of Final Fantasy III's world as compared to the first 2 entries. So despite its quirky qualities, there is some great gameplay design here that most definitely evolves the franchise. But what makes it feel like a giant step back from Final Fantasy II is the lack of an interesting story with memorable characters. No matter how limited its approach may have been, Final Fantasy II took strides to turn the generic heroes you play as into actual characters with names and personalities who fight against a tyrannical empire and a fascinating story of rebellion and sacrifice. But Final Fantasy III, it rehashes the cookie-cutter premise of Final Fantasy I, where 4 unnamed heroes must save the world by interfacing with elemental crystals scattered across the lands. And while there are some guest characters who will periodically accompany your party in Final Fantasy III, they don't actually fight alongside you in combat unlike the second game, and they're nowhere near as likable or memorable as the guests from Final Fantasy II. Sadly, I didn't find anything interesting whatsoever about the world in Final Fantasy III. It was just too uninspired. Okay, maybe I would have in the Nintendo DS remake, which did infuse the world of Final Fantasy III with fleshed out characters and a more compelling narrative, from which I'm ashamed to admit I used the poster for this video's thumbnail, even though that's not the version of the game I played. It looked cool, alright? I'm sorry. But I digress. Interestingly, where Final Fantasy III takes a step back, though not to its detriment, is in its combat system. As I said earlier, Final Fantasy III feels very reminiscent of the first game. And when it comes to the combat, this is by no means a bad thing. While I did prefer the combat of Final Fantasy II to the first game, largely because of the freedom it offered, I did admittedly prefer the mana system of the first one. Final Fantasy III brings that right back, whilst improving upon what I already liked about Final Fantasy II's combat system. Being able to give any one of your characters any playstyle was pretty great in Final Fantasy II, but 3 took this system and gave it some structure via the job system, which quite literally perfected what I already liked about the second game. As a side note, I liked how you unlock these new jobs in Final Fantasy III via interfacing with one of the 4 elemental crystals after defeating a major boss. This progression was really satisfying. Side note over. Another thing about Final Fantasy II was that it put a limit on the number of spells you could learn, which wasn't the case in the third game. I loved how I could learn every single spell relevant to my job in Final Fantasy III. It was very satisfying to fill out my White Mage's entire catalog by the end of the game. And once again, having an MP system based on spell uses as opposed to spell cost is something that I personally much prefer. Like I said earlier though, I do have to ask, for a game that's largely cut from the same cloth as Final Fantasy I, which did have ethers, why were there no ethers in Final Fantasy III? This game could be brutal at times due to its lack of them, which in turn made it very grindy. And generally speaking, I do not like having to grind in games, so this was something I was not at all a fan of. There were some absurd difficulty spikes in Final Fantasy III, with enemies all of a sudden 1 to 2-shotting me halfway through a dungeon. I cannot imagine how hard and frustrating it must have been to play this game in its original state and go through these dungeons without the quick saves and autosaves of the Pixel remaster. Yeah, these enemies would essentially kick me out of their domain by forcing me to teleport out of a dungeon, to grind against a group of mobs to get stronger, and then return to face them again, but after having gone through the entire dungeon again basically from the very beginning. It is pretty much a given that you'll have to dedicate a solid chunk or two of your playthrough to do this, so that you have an adequate amount of HP and MP to be able to take on these formidable dungeons to their fullest. And I personally did not like that. So much of this could have been alleviated had Aether simply been in the game. Their omission is a big mystery to me. Overall though, I personally had a good time in Final Fantasy III, all things considered, but I can recognize how not everyone might feel the same way. It has so many divisive elements and leaves a lot to be desired with the steps it takes back from Final Fantasy II, and unless you're a fan of the job system in the Final Fantasy series, then there's not much in this experience for you. So with that said, my final verdict for Final Fantasy III is that you should proceed with caution. I'd encourage you to try the game yourself to form your own opinion, especially given how accessible it is now with the fantastic features of the Pixel Remaster. This is definitely one of those Final Fantasies that will either appeal to you or not, based on your personal preferences. As I noted at the start of this review, Final Fantasy III is a quirky game, largely due to its bizarre creative decisions. As a result, I had mixed feelings about almost everything in the game, with only one aspect that I did love and one that I did not, with no middle ground. Come to think of it though, there is one other thing that I did love here, and that I don't think will ever change for any of the other games in this wonderful series, and that's the music. At first, like with everything else in this game, I was unsure of how I felt about it. But as I continued my journey, the soundtrack got better and better, and I was pleasantly surprised at the variety of tracks here. For example, there was a different tune for the different airships you'd commandeer, and a different tune for the different kinds of dungeons you'd go through. And some of the town themes were simply beautiful, and at times vied for bringing a tear to my eye. Probably the best soundtrack out of the first 3 games so far, no doubt. Uematsu simply never disappoints. And neither do you guys, since I really appreciate you for checking out my review video today. Now, I've already dove into Final Fantasy IV, and I'm loving every single second of it. I won't elaborate on that since I want to save all my thoughts for that game's mini review, which I'll be doing next, but I'm really happy to say that it's been incredible in every way so far. So, if you guys want to catch me freaking out over that game live, then be sure to head over to twitch.tv/irritableindian. And if you want to check out the VODs of the playthrough or any of my other ones, including this FF3 one that we just completed, then you can check those out on my second YouTube channel. That's Irritable Archives. But until the next one, folks, take care of yourselves, and as always, keep on keeping on.